And change the screen. Welcome to this webinar with Professor David Hughes. We're very excited to have David with us today. I would just like to start with an acknowledgement. We acknowledge we are meeting on the traditional lands of the I am on the traditional lands of the Wurundjeri, Wurrung and Bunurong peoples of the East Kulin Nations, and I'd like to pay our respects to their elders past, present and emerging. We extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders, wherever everyone is that's joining us today, and we acknowledge their connection to country, relationship with the land and all living things extending back tens of thousands of years. So welcome, and welcome to everyone on the land that you're meeting from today. So welcome to our program. We are very excited to have David joining us. I just thought I'd give you a bit of a rundown before David starts. So I'll just tell you a little bit about our program AgTech Seeds, and then we'll have a presentation from David on consumer and food industry trends, which I know everyone will really enjoy. And then we'll have a session at the end for questions. So please start thinking about any questions you might have for David. And please either use the hand raising or the chat function, or just come off mute and put your camera on and we can have a good chat, because I'm sure there'll be lots of thought-provoking discussion. Okay, so AgTech Seeds. So my name is Nikki Marks and I'm the Program Manager for the AgTech Seeds Pre-Accelerator Program at Rocket Seeder. Rocket Seeder is a not-for-profit startup support accelerator and pre-accelerator program that runs out of the University of Melbourne. And Emma Coath, who's with us today, is our wonderful Managing Director. Thank you, Emma. So AgTech Seeds has been funded by Launch Vic and by Agriculture Victoria. So it's at the moment, it's just for Victorian startups and Victorian researchers and entrepreneurs with a business idea, but it's a fully funded program for early stage researchers and entrepreneurs to develop and validate innovative ideas in AgTech. So at the moment, the focus is very much on farm, but we like to think that by joining up the whole value chain, we extend, that platform so that we're able to work along the whole value chain, which is why we were keen to hear David today, because he brings that demand-driven approach to our supply-driven program, which is very valuable, as you know, because that's how value is created. So AgTech Seeds is a partnership between Rocket Seeder and Cruxis Innovation. Cruxis deliver the technical component and Rocket Seeder delivers the networks and the innovation ecosystem component. And the program involves an introduction to key business skills, connection to potential marketer partners and customers, access to a team of expert mentors and advisors, and support for anyone that participates in the program to develop a minimum viable product, or the opportunity for qualifying participants to do that. So happy to talk more about the program later or another time, but we have run one really successful program. We've got another 3, one in Feb, one in the second half of next year. They run for about 3 months, and one in the first half of 2024, but happy to chat with anyone about that anytime. So the program, if you're interested, is applications are due on the 28th of November. We start in Feb. We have a launch day in Feb and then a final showcase in May. Yes, so with no further ado, please let me introduce Professor David Hughes. So I've printed out David's CV, and as you can imagine, after being in the food and drink sector for 40 years, there is a lot that David has done and continues to do. David has lived and worked all over the world, and it's always been involved in food and drink, as he will no doubt share with you soon. He has a constantly evolving informed view on global food industry developments, from consumer, grocery, retail and food service at one end of the value chain to life science companies at the other end, with everything in between. He is constantly engaging with senior directors and managers of food and beverage companies, R&D organisations, farmer-owned businesses, and of course government. He has direct involvement with food firms in the UK and the USA and sits on boards in several countries. So he's very well qualified to talk about things, and David is an amazing presenter, as you will see. So as you can tell, I'm very excited that you're here, David. David has academic links with the Centre for Value Chain Research at the University of Kent and Imperial College London. He examines PhD level research on food industry strategic management issues. He is also a visiting fellow at the Royal Agricultural College in the UK, which really helps connecting with the farming community. So with no further ado, I will stop sharing my screen and hand you over to David. But David, please just bear with me. I will stop sharing, and that means you can start sharing.
I can start. Hang on. Thanks very much, Nikki and Emma, and thanks, Taylor, for the backup. And I hope, oops, let's see, put it on full. Is that okay? Have you got it?
Yeah, all good, David. Perfect.
Right, I'm just going to try and remove your pretty pictures. Oh, that's it. If I put you, off we go. Oops, won't be a second. Just so I can see my own screen. Right. Okay. Well, off we go. So where am I? I'm on the Welsh border in the UK, in the chaotic country in which I live. And I just to put up my first slide, which I take from my Saturday comic, which is The Economist. This is back 2 weeks ago. And I just loved it. Rejoice, me hearties. There's another new Tory Prime Minister at the helm. And here we are in total chaos. But let that be as it may be. And just very quickly, my background, Nikki's already told you bits and bobs about me. I'm involved directly at the moment in the food industry, although I never thought I would be at this stage. And so I'm if not a co-owner, at least a financier of a food service business, which is started by one of my sons and his wife, which is the Royal George Hotel and Restaurant, and a ghost kitchen for their takeaway business and a cafe, and it's all in Devon. And my word, that's been a challenge over the last 3 years, as you can probably manage, going through COVID, etc. And I wanted to show in history, I had to go back to 35 years ago. I'm getting nearer you in agriculture here. Myself, I'm the sort of bald guy on the right in the middle, and my partner, Jerry St. Andre, who was an American, and we set up all the way back in 1988, a sort of early hydroponic business in southern Florida, south of Miami. You can get south of Miami, almost on where the Keys start. And we started a hydroponic fresh herb, or herb, as the Americans whimsically call it, and we produced fresh herbs for sale at retail. Our major customer was Publix, which is the principal. It's like the Woolies of Florida. It's got something like 55–60% grocery market share, and that was we held that for about how many years? 15 years, nigh on, and then sold it. And I just wanted to share with you that if you look down the bottom right-hand side, it's got Hurricane Andrew's 30th anniversary, which was this year. But back in August 1992, when we'd been in business for 4 years, our entire business, it was a startup business. We bought 5 acres of land, expanded that to 20 acres and put up 20 acres of greenhouses, which is quite a lot, actually. And 4 years after starting, Hurricane Andrew picked up our entire business and dropped it in the Gulf of Mexico. And why I wanted to tell you that is that, reminds me that if you're into your own business, if you're entrepreneurial, then you better be able to show resilience. And we sure did that. So August 24, we were wiped out, and we had record sales for Christmas of that year. For December 1992, we managed to build the business back quickly. So if you're into entrepreneurialism, then you need resilience. Okay, so quickly, look, I've got a whole pile of slides here, and they're all available to you if you wish, if you so sadly wish to see individual ones after the talk. But and I'm going to flip through them quickly. And so here's a headline I just didn't expect to see in my lifetime. Going back, 5 months ago. Russian invaders attempt to reopen Danone Ukraine plant. And then a month or two later, I'm reading my other comic, which is the Grocer, the trade paper for the food industry in the UK. And it was, telling us what we might wish to eat in the middle of a nuclear attack. And then can you imagine, just back August 30th, that the nuclear plant in the Ukraine, we were providing anti-radiation tablets to Ukrainians. I mean, who would have thought? I was born in 1948, for God's sake, so post-war baby, and we convinced ourselves that that was it in terms of war in Europe, but not so. And what's intrigued me, if we look back over this sort of tumultuous last 3-year period, if there's a word that's been overused and consistently misused, it's unprecedented. So the pandemic was unprecedented. The war in the Ukraine was unprecedented. High food prices that we saw, particularly in August, was unprecedented. Let me remind you that none of those three issues were unprecedented. Unprecedentedly never happened before. All have happened before, and all will happen again. The Russians invaded Ukraine in 2014, for example. Pandemic, go back 100 years, and the Spanish flu wiped out millions around the world. What about high food prices? Well, I'll show you. If you, here we are, this is up to the FAO chart up to October of this year. Actually, food prices peaked in August of this year. And since then, March of this year. And since then, over the last 6 or 7 months, they've tended to drift down. But was this unprecedented? No. If you went back, follow the map there, the graph, and you can see that back in 1973, food prices peaked at incredible levels. Way too early for you to know why, but I know exactly why they peaked in 1973, because myself and the long-suffering Susan Hughes, my wife, we had just emigrated to Canada, where I was a food policy analyst, and it was just as we arrived, food prices went through the roof. Why did they go through the roof? Wait for this. It was because the Ukrainian and Russian grain harvests failed. By then, they were all under the umbrella of USSR, and they didn't tell anybody. We didn't have the satellite coverage. And so the crops failed. They popped out and bought up all the spare grains they could find, and then announced it on one day, and up went prices. I remember August 73, that the prevailing view was we were moving to a new era in food prices, and they would consistently go up from there. And what happened over the next 30 or 40 years? They went down. And what I've been hearing, again, go back to March, we're in a new era of high food prices. Well, I'm not sure. The last 6 months, they've started to edge down, and who will know the future? So nothing is unprecedented. And if we think of the pandemic, we're still feeling the impact that it has on our food supply chains. Although that's lost headlines. Why? Because of war and because of the energy crisis that we have at the moment, or at least we do in Europe to a much lesser extent, you do where you are. And what intrigues me is that at least there's some sort of positives come out of these tragedies, these big issues that we've been facing, and not least this sort of explosion of R&D and indeed commercialization of automation in the food supply chain and other supply chains, as we come to terms with, in particular, lack of labor. I know that's a big issue in Australia with not least the harvest of your horticultural crop. It's exactly the same across Europe, and it's forced this automation, R&D and implementation at a rate of knots, I'm delighted to say. And then again, when there's not much said about this, but remember where I'm on the Welsh border. Of a morning, my dog Mabel is under my desk here, and oops, shouldn't mention her name. And she and I go out about 7:30 in the morning, and if I open my door and stand on my doorstep and listen carefully, I can hear a sort of sucking noise, which is China relentlessly hoovering the world's harvest into its storage bins. I mean, more than half of the grain supply of the world is sitting in China. And then look at China's food imports over the last 20 years. What's that about? China increasingly being concerned about its food security. It was much on President Xi's mind, well, at least until he was anointed as president and chairman for life. So, you know, it's such an interesting world, the world of agriculture and food. That's why I love it. There's always something to talk about. And then, of course, climate change, it's very much in the mind's eye at the moment because of COP27. And look at this. I mean, was it yesterday or the day before? UN chief warns we will be doomed without an historic climate pact. And there's just the evidence is sort of overwhelming. There's not here. We've got for example, looking at how sea levels are rising. On the right-hand side is a map of actually England, and the little numbers are areas that the British government have said within the last 3 or 4 months that they cannot defend from in terms of sea levels rising. So if you happen to have houses in these areas, you're on your own, unless you can bring the Dutch in. The Dutch are very good at stopping water, by the by. And every week, sad am I just check on the US drought monitor. Here it is for a couple of weeks ago or 10 days ago. They have some drought, that's endemic drought. So what? Well, the US is the largest agricultural exporter in the world. Of course, you don't have to worry about climate change in Australia, or do you? And clearly you do. So we have all these things happening at the moment which have a direct impact on our food industry and will affect it going forward for sure. Back to my comic, The Economist. I love this. This is Cal, who is the cartoonist for The Economist and for the Baltimore Sun, by the way. Here's his climate change rapid response team in the US who are mounted on a snail. And I'm reminded from the wee graph there, which is a Rabobank graph, and it's just on the left-hand side, it's saying, these are the calories we produced in 2010. These are the calories that we need to produce in 2050 if we're to feed the 10 billion people there will be in the world. And then moving to the right, this is the CO2, the carbon dioxide, the carbon impact it will have if we don't change our production methods. And then on the far right, where the green is, this is what we've promised in terms of 2050 and carbon neutrality, etc. And it's just a reminder for me about how much we've promised as a world and how little we've delivered and how it's got to change going forward. Okay, so what about the impact of, particularly if we focus on high food prices at the moment? Well, I was taken, this was yesterday or the day before, was it yesterday? In the UK, a quarter of UK adults have less than £100, which is what, 170 Australian dollars, set aside in savings. I mean, what, 25% of households with less than $200 of savings? It's sort of appalling. And then look at the group of the population in the UK who are going to have particular problems. And my graph there just shows household income by decile. So the bottom 10% in the UK essentially have got household incomes of less than 25,000 Australian dollars. The people at the top are $300,000 plus. And I would suggest that, I don't know, probably 35, 40% of UK households will be in real trouble this year and next year because of the pressure on their incomes, the pressure on food prices, the pressure on mortgages and rents. And as I say there, I've got Ginger Rogers and Fred Astaire. There may be trouble ahead. Do you remember? It's, again, you're too young for this. There may be trouble ahead, My update is, yes, there will be. We will see lots of trouble. But you can sit back and relax because it's a different scene in Australia, or not, as the case may be. Here we've got Australian income, so by quintile. So this is splitting households into 5 sections in Australia, and it tells me that the bottom 20% of households in your country are earning $24,000 or less. Do you think they're going to find it a little challenging this year and next year? Damn right they will. And it's just made for me that I was talking 2 or 3 weeks ago in Australia, in Geelong, and I was talking to a very senior person in Coles who is on the board of Food Bank, and he gave me this data that said like 4%, right now, 4% of all Aussie households are receiving food relief. It's scary, frankly. Moving on. And what's the impact of this? You've got this fair proportion of people who are clearly, they're struggling and will continue to struggle. what we're seeing is pressure in the agri-food chain as retailers start to fight with each other to try and secure their grocery market share. In the UK, Tesco is again our equivalent of a Coles or a Woolies. They're the #1 retailer, and what they do is they price match Aldi. And I put this up. I mean, here's Hearty Food thin pepperoni pizza. Okay, Hearty Food Company is owned by Tesco, and they're selling pizzas for essentially $1 Oz a pizza. I mean, I can't see how you can buy the package for a pizza for $1. And we're just seeing this they're at each other's throats. Who bears the pain of this? Typically, it's supply chain members, not least farmers. Same in the US. Here we are. Here's Aldi, who are they're the fastest growing retailer in the US, by the way, Aldi. And you can buy a Thanksgiving dinner for $10 for under $30. I mean, that's like $3 a head for the most important meal of the year in the US market, which is Thanksgiving at the end of November here. Luckily for us, we're sort of blessed because we have Marks and Spencer's, and going back to Valentine's Day, February 14th, they always put in a dine-in for two for the romantics for £20. So, 30, what is it, for 35 Oz, where we got a coquille Saint-Jacques, a seafood starter, sirloin steaks, sides, desserts, heart-shaped chockies, and a bottle of Prosecco for $1.35. How is it done? I don't know. It's done often at the expense of suppliers. And what we're seeing around the world is that shopping habits are changing. In the UK, we're switching to discount supermarkets, buying less items in toto, buying less alcohol, buying more value private label, looking for advice and trying to reduce food waste, which is good. Of concern, we're compromising on some of our sustainability concerns. We're eating out less. And in the UK, we're staying home more for our holidays. And specifically, what are we buying less of? As I said, alcohol, actually not in this household, I can assure you. Cakes and bickies, those sort of indulgent treats that we get, they're starting to go the way of all flesh, as we really have to push. Same in the US. What are they doing? Buying fewer or less expensive items, looking for deals all the time, cutting back on non-essentials, etc. It's hard work being in the agri-food industry at the moment. And in terms of the sort of mega trends, actually today, Innova Market Insights, which is a huge market research company, has their webinar, which I'll be listening to, on the top 10 trends for 2023. And their #1 trend is, they refer to it as redefining value. And what are consumers doing? They're saying, okay, we've got a set of values. And if we went back pre-COVID, when we had time and money, then we were looking for more sustainable products, greener products, if you will, better animal welfare. But now we're in the middle of this problem. We're redefining value. What can we afford to buy? We have to compromise on some of the social issues, which in history have been particularly important. I'll come back to that in a minute. For example, in the UK, high welfare meat, so more animal-friendly livestock, if you will, is suffering through this food price crisis. We're seeing a fall off in demand for organic produce, and even local seasonal produce is being sort of pushed to the side. I can only afford to buy the cheapest, if you see what I mean. Moving on, but social issues apart. And just to remind us, what do people, let's go pre-COVID, in more normal times, what drives people's demand for food? What do they buy? Things they love. They love the taste. They want low price. They want high quality. They want something on sale. It makes you feel better. They like brands. And don't forget, they like convenience. And also, when they have the moment and when they have the money, they want values that reflect their own values. As we've gone over the last 3-5 years, we've seen this sort of astonishing change, as far as I can see, in terms of the sort of configuration of the supply chain. the COVID, the pandemic itself, of course, it accelerated direct delivery of groceries to home. And my little, when I was a proper academic, I'm a sort of improper one at the moment. I was Sainsbury Professor of Food Business at the University of London, and so I had a special relationship with Sainsbury's. And 100 years ago, Sainsbury's had a young man on a little bike deliver groceries to the likes of my mum. And now if we fast forward 100 years, we've got some slightly older young men on slightly better bikes doing it. And so, you know, there's this sort of, wow, isn't it wonderful? Everything's delivered. Everything was delivered. For my mum, she had, you know, her fruit and veg was delivered. The fish and meat was delivered. Mr. Barnes, the grocer, delivered. And now we're seeing more of that. And that will continue to rise in, and often, you know, from a food industry point of view, is that good? Well, what it does, it's sort of, I've noticed, because we have our groceries delivered by Tesco, that you tend not to browse. You tend to buy or just tick the boxes that you bought last week. So it's challenging if you want people to try new things. Moving on, and we've seen the emergence of rapid delivery groceries that came from nowhere, for goodness sake. And across Europe, you can't move for these rapid, you know, within 15-minute deliveries. Getir comes from Turkey, but it's right across Europe. They're in the process of looking to buy Gorillas, which is a Berlin-based company, which is also right across Europe. GoPuff is from the US, that's in our own market. Dija, etc. They came from nowhere, and as often happens, and I'll come back to this, they sort of overcooked it. They sort of amassed enormous value from a market cap point of view, and now suddenly they're sort of struggling to show the market that they can actually turn a profit. And then the whole eating out in has just accelerated through the pandemic too, whether it be Uber Eats or Just Eat or, you know, or Deliveroo, whatever it is, or your equivalent in Australia. And so now this is just firmly entrenched itself as part and parcel of how we consume meals. HelloFresh. Again, these are just sort of new routes to the consumer for food, if you will. HelloFresh, which you'll have in Australia, it's in 17 countries. I mean, actually, its stock price, its share price has collapsed, but it's still got a market capitalization of Aussie 6 billion. It'll be with us and with us for a long time. It's a new way to get food and meals to consumers. Are my products, do they have a role? Should they be part of the HelloFresh supply chain? And I think it just sort of underpins for me, if I look at how do consumers solve their meal problems. So, you know, I'm of a certain age. I'm not in the first flush of youth, you'd be surprised to know. And that when Susan and I started our life together, we used to actually go out, and I'll use a word here which you're not familiar with. We used to go out and buy ingredients. And then we sort of put those together and made meals, and we referred to it as scratch cooking. Of course, that's way in the past, and we've moved from buying ingredients to buying meal components and then bolting them together to make a meal, or buying the ready meals itself. That's on the right-hand side, all the way from retail. On the left-hand side from food service, you know, food service was going out to eat in a restaurant or maybe a cafe. But then that's moved on. I mean, now there are restaurant dark kitchens like the one my son and daughter-in-law have for their delivery and takeout part of their business. And so we can eat out in, as I mentioned. And all we're seeing, if I look across the food chain globally now, is that food retail and food service is converging. They sell the same thing, which is the meal solution. What's the implications for people in the farm? That it puts you further away from the consumer because they're buying that meal solution, and you are buying an ingredient bought by somebody who puts that together into a meal format or a meal component format, which is sort of challenging because it pushes you away from the consumer. And I can see that in my own, let's say my own market here. I'm in Morrison's, which is our number 4 or 5 retailer. You know, a typical aisle, tonight's takeaway, sorted. Or let's go to Tesco, our number 1 retailer, and, you know, again, a typical, you know, lunch at home, kids' lunch, family meals. It's not so much ingredients, it's the solving the problem for us. On the right-hand side, out of interest, there's a Tesco 2 handmade mince pies for dogs. Why did I pop that in? Because it just reminded me in your own market that particularly during the pandemic, that as we started upped the number of pets we have at home, particularly dogs and particularly those with double O's in their name, you know, the doodles. And now you've got a market of 20 billion Oz dollars in Australia for pet foods and related pet toys and etc. Don't forget about those. Can you tap into that market? Brilliant. Okay, so from a consumer point of view, consumers have sort of got the power is on their plate. They've sort of realized that their decisions on what they purchase in terms of food and drink can influence things other than filling their tummies, like the environment. And so they're concerned about aspects relating to sustainability. And what we're seeing in Europe, and you'll see it, and you're already seeing it in Australia, is that, so for example, food products will have increasingly Nutri-scores. So traffic light labels on food saying, is this a green one or is it a red one? And I say to all the guys that I work with, how will your food products score? Will it be a green traffic light or a red traffic light? Because that will influence the degree that people are willing to sort of purchase them. So we start with that relates to health. And you can see it in at retail. Here we are in Morrison's again, or it might be Tesco's. So it's foods with less than 100 calories, or looking down the aisle, gut health support. Food with gut and immune systems have had their benefits boosted hugely by the pandemic. Moving on. And then after Nutri-scores, we move into eco-scores, which are just starting to arrive. This is sort of complex and controversial, but they're being tried by many retailers in Europe, where similar again, it's the traffic lights. Are you a green for the environment or a red for the environment? What is it for your products? New eco labels to get supermarket trials, a big step forward for transparency. So all the majors in the UK are trialing out traffic lights for eco scores right at the moment. And is that just too difficult for consumers? You know, is it too complex? Well, for eco scores and enviro scores and Nutri scores, no. No, actually, why? Because there's an app for that. Thank the Lord, there's an app for everything. I thought I'd just pop in here that there's such a big coverage by market trend analysts, etc., about plant-based foods. And it's just to show you in the UK, who are the sort of people who are driving plant-based food demand. So I've got Tesco data here, and I've segmented it using the Tesco family groups. And what it shows you is that you can see that on the right-hand side, younger, normally higher educated, higher income consumers and households who are balancing work and socializing are particularly more likely to be purchasing plant-based foods than, if we go to the far left-hand side, the segment which is on a budget empty nesters, which is older, poorer people, and then everything in between. And in many markets that I go to, this sort of drive for plant-based comes from younger millennials who, as I said, are higher income and higher education. And I think they will take that going forward, by the by. And when we talk about plant-based, we tend to think about sort of fake meat or plant-based meats. And here's Fable, which is an Australian product, which has got close to $5 million to launch in the US back a year ago. I'm just saying, good luck. If you think $5 million is going to make it for you in the US market for something like fake meat, then think again, because actually fake meat has been struggling in many markets. That doesn't mean it won't find a place. But if I look at JBS, who you know well in Australia, JBS is the largest food company in the world, by the way. It's at $110 billion US turnover. And it's just shuttered its Planterra, a plant-based meat brand, after just 2 years. Maple Leaf in Canada, I'm a Canadian as well as a Brit, has just cut its plant-based business by 25%. So plant-based meats are struggling. Why? Because often the product has just not delivered. And should we worry if you're in the livestock and meat industry? And I say no. Look on the left. That's the ingredient list for pretend eggs and also for the Beyond Burger. Just look at it. You know, I've read shorter books. And what I do is I put on the right-hand side, if at retail, here's some Aussie pork, I would make sure that I have on the pack underneath it, ingredient list, pork. Just remind people that's what it is. And the same for eggs. But, you know, should we write off plant-based? Not at all. Here's Nestle, the #2 food company in the world, launching, you know, vegan Kit Kat, for God's sake, across a whole range of countries in Europe. And plant-based brings huge opportunity at the farm level. Here's Roquette, which is the largest processor of peas in the world, turning it into pea protein. And they just opened a huge plant in Portage la Prairie in Manitoba. Moving on. And so this whole area of sustainability is, it's going, it has huge traction, and it's gaining ground, especially in Europe, where particularly the major players are starting to make big promises about what they're going to do through the supply chain. As I point out to them, they say, look, the PepsiCos of this world, the Tescos of the world, you don't grow anything, yet you're making promises about the carbon impact of your supply chain. Have you had an appropriate conversation with those that do grow it? And in most cases, no. And actually, a lot of this sort of consideration about carbon, I think, relates to the soil. And that's where most of the carbon is stored, for goodness sake. Just reminds me that there are huge opportunities for farmers as markets for carbon emerge. And here's Tesco, as I said, insisting on climate friendly farming practices around the world. And it said, have you talked to the growers? Because remember, that's where the carbon impact is. PepsiCo and ADM, Archer Daniel Midland's partner through regen agriculture, so-called, which has become so fashionable. And again, as far as I can see, that's largely about soil quality, soil health. Good thing that we should try and focus on that too. And what I notice at the retail level is that major retailers, certainly in Europe, are saying, we want you to be healthy and we want the soil to be healthy, and you can combine the two. Here we are in Sainsbury. Let's eat the world better, 1 pea pesto pasta at a time. And so it's saying, you know, peas are great for the soil, they're nitrogen fixing, etc. They're also good for you. Kale to the rescue, the soul food of the masses. Here we are, bird's eye, good for the land and good for you too. So it's that soil health and consumer health coming together. But it's not just about carbon, clearly. It's also, in this particular case, about water. PepsiCo's net water positive vision. And of course, as you know, packaging. This always sort of intrigues me. Nestle put freeze on plastic pollution in Hong Kong with new paper packaging for Kit Kat ice cream. And when I look at that, you know, Nestle, the #2 food company in the world, you say, why is it taking you so long to get through this? It's sort of astonishing, but you can see there's such a rush right now, the real pressure, even in the midst of a crisis relating to food prices, that consumers, packaging, they are concerned about, and they want to see, you know, is it good packaging? Is it sustainable? Is it biodegradable or whatever the hell it may be? And I often think too, from an innovation point of view, that actually, that innovation will save the day eventually. So just one little example, US startup Protein Evolution lands $20 million US to scale up enzymatic plastic recycling. So I think the whole issue about plastic waste, if we could fast forward 10 or 15 years, will have disappeared, because technology and science will have cut in, so it is not a problem. It may even be a benefit. We can see this now. Here's a peel with protected English cucumbers. So removing that plastic from a cucumber and just coating it with a substance which is made from byproducts of peel, seed, and pulp of all fruits, which sort of extends the life of cucumbers without adding plastic. You know, brilliant, actually, a peel. And then also it's about food waste. Food waste is highest on farm, but it's also high in home. And I was taken with, here's Hellmann's, which is, of course, mayonnaise produced by Unilever now. And they've got a wonderful campaign running at the moment saying, there's more in your fridge than you think. They're saying, use the stuff, your food you've already got in your fridge that you're going to waste, mix it with Hellmann's, and you can make it into something which is really tasty. So food waste is a big issue. Remember, 12.3 United Nations Sustainable Development Goal, we said that we would halve food waste by 2030. We're nowhere near there, yet we made the promises. And this whole area of just using upcycled products, so taking waste and turning them something into which has a revenue stream and a benefit for consumers. It's big and it will just grow. Real opportunities for on-farm, I would suggest. And then quickly, if I look at these sort of emerging technologies, I know you'll be into this, but if you look at Gartner and the cycle here, I'm taking with it. So we've got, a new technology emerges. It races up in terms of people embracing it and backing it financially. I'll give you some examples in a minute. So you get this sort of peak of inflated expectations, and then suddenly, oh my God, it's not as we thought. It collapses to the trough of disillusionment, and then slowly it recovers through the slope of enlightenment to the plateau of productivity. What do I mean by that? Well, a good example would be back to plant-based meats. If you look at Impossible Foods and their Beyond Meat brands, or indeed Oatly and its oat milk, which is a Swedish company, both these companies attracted billions of dollars and then have failed to deliver on their promises relating to sales and certainly to profitability. Does that mean that they have no future? Of course they have a future, but it will be at a much lower level of profitability. I think to some extent you could say the same about vertical farming. I've watched with astonishment as the market valuations given to startup vertical farming companies have sort of moved into the hundreds of millions and billions. I think it defies economic gravity, and we're just starting to see some of them fall flat on their backsides. Does that mean vertical farming has no future? Of course it does, but it will have to go through the profiles that we've just done. I mean, for every company, no. There's a company called Plenty in the US, which is partnering with Driscoll's, who you know well in Australia. And I know Driscoll's really well. I know the owners really well. And they don't invest just blithely. They'll have given it a lot of thought, I can assure you. Or anything to do with CBD, cannabinoids, if I pronounce it correctly. That sort of worries me, that it's seen as being extraordinarily fashionable. And say, are you sure there's the regulatory structures in place in many countries to allow it to grow? No, it's probably going to go flat and then build from there. And I pop this in. I've done a lot of work in the past with Rabobank, used to sit on their advisory board for about 20 years. And they have this sort of food bites program, which is encouraging entrepreneurial development in agri-food. And they just make the point that global food and agri-venture capital investment was, look at this, 52 billion in 2021, thousands of deals, of which 40% were AgTech from dozens of countries. And startups look for finance, partners, customers, media exposure, and the most popular categories from the Rabobank Food Bites was in food ingredients, food market software, and precision agriculture, getting close to you guys, food marketplace technology, and traceability technology for the supply chain, which some of you may well be into. And I just took a couple of the winners, if you will, in terms of funding by Food Bites. And I like the Leaf Protein Company out of Australia. No doubt you know all about it. I don't fully understand what the hell it is, but it did well. Oh, We Agro, From Argentina, we provide engineering solutions aimed at serving and monitoring the post-harvest process. So, there's an element of blockchain clearly in that. And here's something from Holland, nettle filaments for rapid prototyping. So there are out there in the marketplace, not least the organization that has put this webinar on, but trying to encourage entrepreneurship. Go and look and see what's happening. Almost done. Just so we've got 10 minutes of talk, or 15, whatever you'll give me. What I always look for, if I look across supply chains and look at agri-food industries around the world, is say, who's trusted? Because in the end, we put food in our mouths, and we've got to do it pretty carefully, or it can see us off. And this is a European report, relatively recent, and it was looking at who do consumers trust across the food supply chain. And actually, in Europe and in most countries, I think it will certainly be the case in Australia. I would bet it's certainly the case in North America, that consumers tend to trust farmers more than they do others in the food supply chain. Sadly, authorities, which is sort of government, and it's often most unfair, tend to be least trusted along with manufacturers. And retailers, particularly big retailers, we're sort of plus and minus about. What's my point here? That I think farmers and the agricultural industry has to recognize that it has substantial leverage and should be sort of communicating more with consumers to get their support, to show consumers that farmers share the same values as consumers, and that we should be working closer in the supply chain. So what's trust all about? It's about transparency from farm to fork. It's about close relationships in the supply chain. It's about shorter value chains. It's more focus on natural and local. You're good at that. Better labeling, and strangely, from a consumer point of view too, they just feel more comfortable with smaller businesses. And almost done here. I sort of tend to finish on this. That if I look back over the last 2.5 years now, was it March 2020 when suddenly the world had to close down. And for somebody like me, I've spent my life, I'm hardly Mr. Green, sort of just wandering around the world talking to food industry people in so many countries. And so I've just been I was locked at home for the better part of 2 years, and I was grumpy, wasn't a particularly good husband. And whenever I felt that, I hadn't been dealt a proper hand, I just sort of put this up. Pink Lady, which of course has Australian heritage from WA, they put out the Food Photographer of the Year competition each year. And this is for 2021. It wasn't the winner. Have a look, by the way, for 2022. There's some brilliant food photographs. And this was a near winner. And I put it up. Here's a couple in their 40s, probably late 40s, just outside Dhaka in Bangladesh, sitting on their little truck on a garbage heap, eating their lunch. And I'm just reminded that, how lucky we are. You're the lucky country, for goodness sake. And that whenever I think about food, I'm reminded that sadly this year, there will be the better part of 880 million people in our world who wake up hungry and go to bed hungry. And we started to get some hold on that. If we went back pre-COVID, it was down to 820 million. But the last 2 or 3 years have been particularly harsh on people in our world who are least able to handle that. And we should remember that it's not their problem, it's our problem, it's our combined problem, and we have to address it. And that's me done, Nikki and Emma, and happy to have a bit of a chat if we can.